Have you ever heard a whisper that changed everything? In the heart of an old, mysterious mansion, young housekeeper Carlos embarks on a journey that will transform lives. Meet Carlos, a determined young man seeking a better life for his family, who discovers more than just a job at the Abernathy mansion. Meet Mr. Abernathy, an elderly man burdened by a tragic past, whose mute silence holds secrets that could unlock healing. The old mansion stood at the end of a long, winding driveway, shrouded in mystery. Tall trees, their branches heavy with leaves, formed a canopy that cast dappled shadows on the path below. Overgrown gardens surrounded the house, with ivy creeping up its stone walls, giving it an air of faded grandeur. It was a place that seemed to hold secrets in every corner, waiting to be discovered. Carlos stood at the gate, taking in the sight before him. He was a young man in his mid-20s, with a determined look in his eyes and a spring in his step. This was his first day as a housekeeper at the Abernathy mansion, and he was eager to make a good impression. The job meant a lot to him. It was a chance to prove himself and to support his family back home. Carlos had grown up in a small town where opportunities were scarce. His father had passed away when he was young, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings alone. The responsibility of helping his family had always weighed heavily on his shoulders. This job at the Abernathy mansion was his chance to make a real difference in their lives. As he walked up the driveway, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, Carlos couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He had heard stories about the mansion and its inhabitants, but he was determined to form his own opinions. At the front door, Carlos was greeted by Mr. Thompson, the head housekeeper. Mr. Thompson was a stern man in his 60s, with gray hair neatly pulled back and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He gave Carlos a brief nod of approval. "You must be Carlos," he said, his voice brisk. "Come inside, and I'll show you around." The interior of the mansion was just as grand as the exterior, with high ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and polished wood floors. Carlos followed Mr. Thompson through the entrance hall, admiring the elegant furnishings and the sense of history that permeated the place. "Your main responsibility will be to look after Mr. Abernathy," Mr. Thompson explained as they walked. "He's elderly and mute, so you'll need to be patient and attentive. He communicates through gestures and written notes. You'll get used to it." Carlos nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy for Mr. Abernathy. He couldn't imagine what it must be like to lose the ability to speak. He was determined to do his best to make the elderly man's life as comfortable as possible. They reached a set of large double doors, and Mr. Thompson paused. "This is the library," he said. "You'll spend a lot of time here. Mr. Abernathy enjoys sitting by the window and reading. It's one of the few pleasures he has left." Carlos entered the library and was immediately struck by its beauty. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes of all sizes and colors. A large window overlooked the garden, and a cozy armchair was positioned beside it. Mr. Abernathy sat in the chair, gazing out at the garden with a distant look in his eyes. "Mr. Abernathy, this is Carlos," Mr. Thompson said, his tone softening slightly. "He's here to help you." Mr. Abernathy turned to look at Carlos and gave him a gentle smile. He had kind eyes, but there was a sadness in them that tugged at Carlos's heart. Carlos smiled back and gave a small bow, feeling a bit awkward but wanting to show respect. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Abernathy," Carlos said softly. "I hope I can be of help to you." Mr. Abernathy nodded and picked up a small chalkboard from the table beside him. He wrote a few words on it and showed it to Carlos. "Thank you, Carlos. I look forward to working with you." Carlos felt a wave of relief. Mr. Abernathy seemed kind and approachable, despite his condition. He was determined to do his best to make the elderly man's life a little brighter. The days passed in a routine of cleaning, cooking, and attending to Mr. Abernathy's needs. Carlos found himself growing fond of the old mansion and its quiet, contemplative atmosphere. He spent hours in the library with Mr. Abernathy, reading aloud from the books the old man selected. They developed a silent understanding, a bond that didn't need words. One afternoon, as Carlos was dusting the shelves in the library, he felt a chill run down his spine. He turned around and saw Mr. Abernathy watching him intently. The old man's lips moved slightly, as if he was trying to say something. Carlos's heart skipped a beat. Had he imagined it? He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Mr. Abernathy. The elderly man looked at him with an expression of deep concentration. Then, just as Carlos was about to speak, he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." Carlos's eyes widened in shock. He stared at Mr. Abernathy, who now looked calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. Carlos felt a shiver run down his spine. He had definitely heard it. But how? Mr. Abernathy was mute. Was it possible that he could speak, even if only in whispers? Carlos decided not to mention the incident to Mr. Thompson or the other staff. He didn't want to seem foolish, and he wasn't sure if anyone would believe him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Abernathy's story than met the eye. That night, as Carlos lay in bed, he replayed the moment over and over in his mind. He was determined to find out what had caused Mr. Abernathy to whisper those words. What kind of help did he need? And why had he chosen to confide in Carlos? The next day, Carlos resumed his duties with a newfound sense of purpose. He kept a close eye on Mr. Abernathy, looking for any signs that the old man might try to communicate with him again. He also started to pay more attention to the mansion itself, noticing the little details he had overlooked before. He learned that the mansion had been in the Abernathy family for generations. It was filled with old portraits and antiques, each with its own story. Carlos couldn't help but wonder what secrets the house held, and if any of them were connected to Mr. Abernathy's whisper. One evening, as Carlos was tucking Mr. Abernathy into bed, he decided to take a chance. "Mr. Abernathy," he said softly, "if you need help, you can tell me. I'll do everything I can to assist you." Mr. Abernathy looked at him with those kind, sad eyes. He picked up his chalkboard and wrote, "Thank you, Carlos. You're very kind." Carlos felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped for more, but he knew he couldn't push the old man too hard. He had to be patient and let Mr. Abernathy come to him in his own time. As Carlos left the room, he glanced back and saw Mr. Abernathy watching him with a thoughtful expression. Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of discovering something important, something that could change both their lives. The days continued to pass in a blur of routine, but Carlos's mind was always on that whisper. He spent his free time exploring the mansion, looking for clues that might help him understand what Mr. Abernathy had meant. He read through old letters and diaries, hoping to find a hint of the mystery that seemed to hang over the house. One afternoon, as Carlos was dusting a bookshelf in the library, he found an old, leather-bound book that seemed out of place. It was hidden behind a row of more recent volumes, its cover worn and faded. Curious, he pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches, detailing the history of the Abernathy family. Carlos's heart raced as he read through the entries, each one revealing a piece of the puzzle. He learned about the tragedies and triumphs that had shaped the family's legacy, and the secrets that had been buried over the years. As he turned the pages, Carlos came across a passage that made him pause. It described a terrible accident that had occurred many years ago, involving Mr. Abernathy and his family. The details were vague, but it was clear that the event had left deep emotional scars. Carlos felt a surge of empathy for Mr. Abernathy. He realized that the old man's whisper was connected to this painful past. But what exactly had happened? And how could he help Mr. Abernathy find peace? Determined to find answers, Carlos decided to dig deeper. He knew that he had to tread carefully, respecting Mr. Abernathy's privacy while seeking the truth. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore the whisper that had set him on this path. As the sun set over the mansion, casting long shadows across the gardens, Carlos felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would uncover the secrets of the Abernathy family, and he would help Mr. Abernathy find the peace he deserved. The journey ahead would be challenging, but Carlos was ready to face it, armed with compassion and determination. And so, the first chapter of Carlos' story came to a close, with the promise of many more to come. The old mansion, with its secrets and whispers, had become a place of discovery and hope. And Carlos, the young housekeeper with a heart full of empathy, was ready to unravel the mysteries that lay within its walls. Carlos awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through his window. The mansion was quiet, and he relished the peaceful moments before his daily duties began. As he dressed and prepared for the day, his mind wandered back to the whisper he had heard from Mr. Abernathy. The words "help me" echoed in his thoughts, urging him to find answers. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with activity as the staff prepared breakfast. Carlos greeted Mr. Thompson, who was directing the kitchen staff with his usual efficiency. "Good morning, Carlos," Mr. Thompson said, handing him a tray with Mr. Abernathy's breakfast. "I trust you're settling in well?" "Yes, thank you," Carlos replied with a smile. "I'm growing quite fond of the mansion." Mr. Thompson gave him a rare smile. "That's good to hear. Mr. Abernathy seems to like you, which is important. He's been through a lot." Carlos nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He carried the tray to the library, where Mr. Abernathy was already seated by the window. The elderly man looked up and smiled as Carlos entered. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," Carlos said, placing the tray on the table beside him. "I hope you slept well." Mr. Abernathy nodded and picked up his chalkboard, writing, "Good morning, Carlos." "Thank you." Carlos set about his tasks, tidying the room and arranging the books on the shelves. As he worked, he couldn't help but steal glances at Mr. Abernathy, wondering what had caused him to whisper those words. He wanted to ask, but he knew he had to be patient. That afternoon, Carlos joined Thomas in the garden. Thomas, the gardener, was a kind-hearted man in his 30s with a wealth of knowledge about the mansion's history. Carlos had found a friend in him, someone he could trust and confide in. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" Carlos began, hesitating slightly. "Of course," Thomas replied, wiping his hands on a cloth. "What's on your mind?" Carlos took a deep breath. "Have you ever heard Mr. Abernathy speak? Even just a whisper?" Thomas looked thoughtful. "No, I haven't. He's been mute for as long as I've known him." "Why do you ask?" Carlos hesitated, then decided to share his experience. "The other day, I heard him whisper 'help me.' I know it sounds strange, but I'm certain of it." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That is strange. Mr. Abernathy lost his voice after a traumatic event many years ago. No one knows exactly what happened, but it must have been terrible." Carlos felt a pang of sympathy. "Do you know anything about that event?" Thomas shook his head. "Not much. The Abernathy family has always been private about their affairs. But if Mr. Abernathy whispered to you, there must be a reason. Maybe he's trying to tell you something important." Carlos nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "I'm going to find out what he needs. I want to help him." Thomas smiled. "You have a good heart, Carlos. Just be careful. The mansion holds many secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered." As Carlos returned to the mansion, he couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Thomas. He felt a growing sense of responsibility to uncover the truth and help Mr. Abernathy. But he knew he had to be careful, as Thomas had warned. That evening, after finishing his duties, Carlos decided to explore the mansion further. He made his way to the attic, a place he hadn't ventured before. The attic was dusty and filled with old furniture covered in sheets. Carlos carefully lifted a sheet, revealing an antique chest. He opened it, finding a collection of old letters and photographs. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, Carlos began to read the letters. They were written by various members of the Abernathy family, chronicling their lives and events that had shaped their history. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. It was from Mr. Abernathy's wife, written shortly before her death. "My dearest Edward," the letter began. "I fear that our family's secrets are too heavy a burden to bear. The tragedy that befell us was not an accident. It was the result of our own actions, and the guilt has consumed me. I only hope that you can find peace and forgiveness in your heart." Carlos's heart raced as he read the letter. What tragedy was she referring to? And what actions had led to it? He knew he had to find out more. The next morning, Carlos decided to broach the subject with Mr. Abernathy. After breakfast, he gently took the elderly man's hand and looked into his eyes. "Mr. Abernathy," Carlos began softly, "I found some letters in the attic. One of them was from your wife. She mentioned a tragedy and a burden of guilt. I want to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" Mr. Abernathy's eyes filled with tears. He picked up his chalkboard and wrote, "It's too painful to remember." Carlos felt a pang of sorrow. "I understand. But sometimes, talking about it can help. You don't have to carry the burden alone." Mr. Abernathy looked at Carlos for a long moment, then slowly wrote, "There was an accident. Our daughter, she died. It was our fault." Carlos's heart ached for the elderly man. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Abernathy. I can't imagine how painful that must be. But you don't have to bear this alone. I'm here for you." Mr. Abernathy nodded, tears streaming down his face. Carlos gently squeezed his hand, offering silent support. He knew that uncovering the full story would take time, but he was determined to help Mr. Abernathy find peace. In the days that followed, Carlos continued his search for answers. He read through more letters and diaries, piecing together the tragic history of the Abernathy family. He learned that Mr. Abernathy's daughter, Emily, had died in a fire that had engulfed part of the mansion. The fire had been caused by a faulty electrical wire, but the family had blamed themselves for not taking better precautions. Carlos also discovered that Mr. Abernathy had lost his voice in the aftermath of the fire, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. The tragedy had left deep emotional scars on the entire family, and Mr. Abernathy had never fully recovered. One afternoon, as Carlos was sorting through old photographs in the attic, he found a picture of Emily. She was a young girl with a bright smile, holding a doll in her arms. Carlos felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the photo, imagining the pain Mr. Abernathy must have felt losing his daughter. Carlos knew he had to share his findings with Mr. Abernathy, but he wanted to do so gently. He decided to bring the photograph to the library, hoping it would help the elderly man open up. "Mr. Abernathy," Carlos said softly, holding out the photo. "I found this in the attic. Is this your daughter, Emily?" Mr. Abernathy looked at the photo and tears welled up in his eyes. He nodded, his hands trembling as he took the picture from Carlos. "She was beautiful," Carlos said gently. "I can see the love you have for her in this photo." Mr. Abernathy nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. He picked up his chalkboard and wrote, "She was my everything." Carlos felt a deep sense of empathy for Mr. Abernathy. "I know it's hard, but talking about her might help you heal. Can you tell me more about Emily?" Mr. Abernathy hesitated, then slowly wrote, "She loved to read. We would sit in this very library for hours, reading together. She had a vivid imagination and a kind heart." Carlos smiled, imagining the scenes Mr. Abernathy described. "She sounds wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with me." Mr. Abernathy nodded, his eyes softening. For the first time since Carlos had started working at the mansion, he saw a glimmer of peace in the elderly man's eyes. As the sun set over the mansion that evening, Carlos felt a sense of accomplishment. He knew there was still much to uncover, but he was making progress. He was determined to help Mr. Abernathy find the peace he deserved, one step at a time. The journey was far from over, but Carlos was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, with compassion and unwavering determination. Morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of the library, casting intricate patterns on the wooden floor. Carlos stood by the window, deep in thought. Over the past few weeks, he had witnessed a transformation in Mr. Abernathy. The elderly man, once shrouded in grief, was beginning to show signs of healing. But Carlos knew there was still one more piece of the puzzle to uncover, the locked room in the West Wing. Carlos had seen the locked door many times while cleaning the mansion, but he hadn't given it much thought until now. Mr. Abernathy's whispered plea for help and the tragic history of the fire had sparked his curiosity. He felt a strong sense that the room held the final key to understanding Mr. Abernathy's pain. Determined to find out more, Carlos approached Thomas one afternoon while he was tending to the roses in the garden. The sun was warm, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. "Thomas," Carlos began hesitantly, "do you know anything about the locked room in the West Wing?" Thomas looked up from his work, his brow furrowed in thought. "The West Wing? Oh, you mean the old nursery. It's been locked up ever since the fire. No one goes in there anymore." Carlos's heart skipped a beat. "The nursery? Was that Emily's room?" Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, it was. After the fire, Mr. Abernathy couldn't bear to set foot in there. He had it locked up and never spoke of it again. Carlos felt a surge of determination. I think it's time to open that room. There might be something in there that can help Mr. Abernathy find closure. Thomas looked at Carlos with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Are you sure, Carlos? That room holds a lot of painful memories. Carlos nodded resolutely. I'm sure. I believe it's the only way to truly help him. That evening, Carlos approached Mr. Thompson with his request. The head housekeeper was sitting in the kitchen, reviewing the household accounts. Mr. Thompson, Carlos began, I need to ask for your permission to open the locked room in the West Wing. I believe it's the key to helping Mr. Abernathy heal. Mr. Thompson looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. The old nursery? Carlos, that room has been locked for years. Are you certain this is the right thing to do? Carlos nodded. I am. Mr. Abernathy has been carrying this burden for too long. I think confronting the past is the only way he can find peace. Mr. Thompson sighed, his stern demeanor softening. Very well, Carlos. I trust your judgment. The key is in the study. Just be careful. Carlos thanked Mr. Thompson and made his way to the study. His heart pounded as he found the key in a drawer and held it in his hand. He felt the weight of responsibility and the hope of uncovering the truth. The next morning, Carlos brought Mr. Abernathy to the West Wing. The elderly man looked apprehensive but didn't resist. Carlos gently guided him down the corridor until they stood before the locked door. Mr. Abernathy, Carlos said softly, I believe it's time to face this together. I'm here with you. Mr. Abernathy nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Carlos inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. The nursery was filled with remnants of a happy past, colorful toys, a small bed with a patchwork quilt, and shelves lined with children's books. Dust covered everything, and the air was heavy with memories. Carlos could almost hear the echoes of Emily's laughter. Mr. Abernathy took a hesitant step inside, his eyes scanning the room. Tears welled up as he reached for a small stuffed bear on the bed. He clutched it to his chest, and Carlos felt a lump in his throat. Emily loved this bear, Mr. Abernathy wrote on his chalkboard. She called it Mr. Snuggles. Carlos smiled through his own tears. It's clear she was very happy here. You created a beautiful space for her. Mr. Abernathy nodded, his expression a mixture of sorrow and fondness. Carlos felt a surge of empathy and knew it was time to share his own discovery. Mr. Abernathy, Carlos said gently, I found a letter from your wife. She wanted you to know that the fire wasn't your fault. She asked you to forgive yourself. Mr. Abernathy's eyes widened in surprise. Carlos handed him the letter, and he read it slowly. Tears streamed down his face as he finished reading. Emily wouldn't want you to suffer like this, Carlos said softly. She would want you to remember the happy times and forgive yourself. Mr. Abernathy nodded, his hands trembling. He wrote, I've been so afraid to remember. But you're right. It's time to let go of the guilt. Carlos felt a sense of relief and hope. You don't have to do this alone. We're all here for you. As they stood in the nursery, surrounded by memories, Carlos felt a deep connection with Mr. Abernathy. The elderly man had faced his past, and together they had taken the first step towards healing. In the days that followed, Carlos and Mr. Abernathy spent more time in the nursery, cleaning and organizing the room. It became a place of reflection and healing, a tribute to Emily's memory. The staff noticed the change in Mr. Abernathy, who seemed lighter and more at peace. One afternoon, as they were placing fresh flowers in a vase on the windowsill, Mr. Abernathy wrote on his chalkboard, Thank you, Carlos. You've helped me find a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. Carlos felt a warm rush of emotion. It's been an honor to help you, Mr. Abernathy. You've shown incredible strength. Mr. Abernathy smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. Carlos knew that their journey was far from over, but they had made significant progress. The mansion, once filled with sorrow and secrets, was now a place of healing and hope. As the sun set over the mansion that evening, Carlos felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had helped Mr. Abernathy confront his past and find a path to peace. The future held promise, and Carlos was ready to continue the journey with compassion and unwavering determination. The whispers of the past had been transformed into a chorus of healing and hope, and the mansion had become a place of new beginnings. The days grew warmer as summer settled over the Abernathy mansion, bringing with it a sense of renewal and hope. Carlos felt the change in the air as he moved through his daily tasks, the weight of the mansion's past lifting ever so slightly. Mr. Abernathy's progress had been remarkable, and Carlos knew that they were close to a breakthrough. One morning, as Carlos brought Mr. Abernathy his breakfast, he noticed a different light in the elderly man's eyes. There was a sense of resolution, of something finally coming full circle. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," Carlos said with a smile, placing the tray on the table. "You look well today." Mr. Abernathy nodded and wrote on his chalkboard, "Good morning, Carlos. I've been thinking a lot about Emily in the nursery. It feels different now. Less painful." Carlos's heart swelled with pride. "I'm so glad to hear that. You've come a long way, and I'm honored to have been part of your journey." Mr. Abernathy reached out and squeezed Carlos's hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Carlos. I couldn't have done it without you." As they shared a quiet moment, Carlos felt a surge of determination to help Mr. Abernathy find closure. He had one more idea, something that could bring them both the peace they sought. "Mr. Abernathy," Carlos began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about the fire and the memories associated with it. I believe there's one more thing we can do to honor Emily and bring healing to this house." Mr. Abernathy looked at Carlos with curiosity. "What do you have in mind?" Carlos took a deep breath. "I think we should hold a memorial for Emily. A small ceremony in the garden where we can celebrate her life and let go of the pain. It could be a way to say goodbye and remember her with love." Mr. Abernathy's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded slowly. "That sounds like a beautiful idea, Carlos. I would like that very much." Over the next few days, Carlos and the staff prepared for the memorial. They cleaned and decorated the garden, planting new flowers and arranging a small altar with photos of Emily and some of her favorite belongings. Thomas helped Carlos choose the perfect spot beneath a large oak tree, where the sunlight filtered through the leaves in a gentle, golden glow. On the day of the memorial, the mansion was filled with a sense of quiet anticipation. The staff gathered in the garden, each holding a single white rose. Carlos stood beside Mr. Abernathy, who looked more serene than Carlos had ever seen him. "Thank you all for being here," Carlos began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We are here to honor the memory of Emily Abernathy, a bright and beautiful soul who brought joy to this house. Today, we celebrate her life and the love she shared with us." Mr. Abernathy stepped forward, holding a small locket that had belonged to Emily. He opened it, revealing a tiny portrait of his daughter, and placed it on the altar. Tears streamed down his face, but there was a sense of peace in his eyes. "Emily was my heart," Mr. Abernathy wrote on his chalkboard. "Her laughter filled this house, and her spirit will always be with us. Today, we let go of the pain and remember the love." Carlos placed a comforting hand on Mr. Abernathy's shoulder, then turned to the gathered staff. "If anyone would like to share a memory or say a few words, please do." Thomas stepped forward, holding his rose gently. "I remember Emily running through the garden, her laughter like music. She loved the flowers and the sunshine. I'll always cherish those moments." One by one, the staff shared their memories, each story painting a vivid picture of Emily's vibrant spirit. Carlos listened, his heart full of love and gratitude for the life that had touched so many. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Carlos led the group in a moment of silence. They each placed their roses on the altar, a symbol of their love and remembrance. Finally, Carlos took Mr. Abernathy's hand and spoke softly. "Mr. Abernathy, would you like to say anything else?" Mr. Abernathy shook his head, then wrote, "Thank you, everyone. This means more to me than words can express." The memorial ended with a sense of quiet reflection. The staff slowly dispersed, leaving Carlos and Mr. Abernathy alone in the garden. The elderly man looked at Carlos with a profound sense of gratitude and love. "Thank you, Carlos," Mr. Abernathy wrote. You've given me the strength to face my past and find peace. I'll never forget what you've done for me." Carlos felt tears welling up in his own eyes. "It's been an honor, Mr. Abernathy. You've shown incredible courage, and I'm so proud of you." They stood together for a long moment, the garden around them filled with the soft sounds of nature. The mansion, once a place of sorrow and secrets, had become a sanctuary of healing and hope. In the days that followed, Carlos noticed a profound change in Mr. Abernathy. The elderly man moved with a lighter step, his eyes brighter and his spirit more at ease. The staff also seemed to share in the newfound sense of peace, the mansion's atmosphere transformed by the memorial and the healing it had brought. One afternoon, as Carlos was tidying up the library, Mr. Abernathy approached him with a small box. He handed it to Carlos with a smile, writing, "I want you to have this." Carlos opened the box to find a delicate silver necklace with a pendant shaped like a rose. Inside the pendant was a tiny inscription, "For Carlos, with love and gratitude." Tears filled Carlos's eyes as he looked at Mr. Abernathy. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. This means so much to me." Mr. Abernathy hugged Carlos gently, and Carlos felt a deep sense of connection and fulfillment. They had journeyed through pain and sorrow together, emerging stronger and closer than ever before. As the seasons changed and the mansion continued to thrive, Carlos knew that the work they had done would leave a lasting impact. The whispers of the past had been transformed into a chorus of healing and hope, and the mansion had become a place of new beginnings. Carlos's heart was full as he looked out at the garden, now blooming with life and color. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Mr. Abernathy would face them together, their bond unbreakable and their spirits forever intertwined. The story of Carlos and Mr. Abernathy was one of resilience, love, and the power of healing. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope, and that with compassion and determination, we can overcome any obstacle and find peace. And so, the mansion stood as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a place where the past was honored and the future was bright. Carlos awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The early morning sun cast a warm glow over the room, filling it with light and a sense of renewal. He took a deep breath, feeling a calm he hadn't known in years. The mansion, which had once seemed so foreboding, now felt like a sanctuary. Downstairs, he found Mr. Abernathy already in the library, sitting by the window with a serene expression. Carlos approached with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy. How are you feeling today?" Mr. Abernathy looked up and smiled, picking up his chalkboard. "Good morning, Carlos. I'm feeling better every day. Thank you for everything." Carlos nodded, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. "I'm glad to hear that. Today, I thought we could spend some time in the garden. It's a beautiful day, and I think it would do us both some good." Mr. Abernathy agreed, and together they walked out into the garden. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors and sweet scents filling the air. Carlos watched as Mr. Abernathy took a deep breath, seeming to draw strength from the beauty around him. As they walked, Carlos couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since he first arrived at the mansion. He had come here looking for a job, but he had found so much more. He had found a purpose, a sense of belonging, and a deep connection with Mr. Abernathy. "Mr. Abernathy," Carlos began, "I've been thinking about everything we've been through. I believe that Emily's spirit is at peace now. We've honored her memory, and I think she would be happy to see how far you've come." Mr. Abernathy nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. He wrote on his chalkboard, "I believe you're right, Carlos. For the first time in years, I feel a sense of peace. I owe it all to you." Carlos shook his head. "You did the hard work, Mr. Abernathy. I was just here to support you. But I have to say, I've learned a lot from you too. You've shown me what true strength and resilience look like." They continued their walk in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they rounded a corner, they came upon a new flower bed that Thomas had planted. It was filled with roses, Emily's favorite flower. Mr. Abernathy stopped and looked at the roses, a smile spreading across his face. He wrote, "These are beautiful. Emily would have loved them." Carlos nodded. "Thomas did a wonderful job. I think this garden is a fitting tribute to her memory." They sat down on a nearby bench, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the beauty of the garden. Carlos felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing that they had come through the darkness and found the light on the other side. In the days that followed, Carlos and Mr. Abernathy settled into a new routine. They spent their mornings in the garden, their afternoons in the library, and their evenings sharing stories and memories. The mansion, once a place of sorrow, had become a place of healing and hope. Carlos also took the time to write letters to his family, sharing the progress he had made and the sense of fulfillment he had found. He knew they would be proud of him, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose in helping them from afar. One afternoon, as they were sitting in the library, Mr. Abernathy handed Carlos a small box. "I have something for you," he wrote on his chalkboard. Carlos opened the box to find a beautiful pocket watch, intricately designed with a rose pattern. Inside, it was engraved with the words, "For Carlos, with gratitude and love." Carlos felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. This means so much to me." Mr. Abernathy smiled and wrote, "You've given me a new lease on life, Carlos. I'll never forget what you've done for me." Carlos hugged the elderly man, feeling a deep sense of connection and fulfillment. They had journeyed through pain and sorrow together, emerging stronger and closer than ever before. As the seasons changed and the mansion continued to thrive, Carlos knew that the work they had done would leave a lasting impact. The whispers of the past had been transformed into a chorus of healing and hope, and the mansion had become a place of new beginnings. Carlos's heart was full as he looked out at the garden, now blooming with life and color. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Mr. Abernathy would face them together, their bond unbreakable and their spirits forever intertwined. The story of Carlos and Mr. Abernathy was one of resilience, love, and the power of healing. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope, and that with compassion and determination, we can overcome any obstacle and find peace. And so, the mansion stood as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a place where the past was honored and the future was bright.